Welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm really excited to get started with today's webinar on differences in sexual preferences. So to set the context, I'm going to read this email that I received from someone. I did change a few details to keep it anonymous while leaving all the relevant particularities. So this person wrote, "My wife of 32 years, who was very sexually adventurous when she was younger, has developed aversions to things she once enjoyed, performing oral sex, being on top, watching porn together, etc., and resistance to trying things she would have not even blinked at back then, such as sex toys. We have a great relationship in marriage, and she enjoys sex and is very orgasmic. But these things have come up as walls in our sex life after 3 decades of marriage. Despite the fact that she has no trauma around them, no religious taboos, no family shaming, etc. She says she really has no idea where they come from." So first of all, to the caring husband who sent me that email, I'm guessing you're watching now or will be watching the replay, and I'm so glad you sent that because you articulate something that this is, of course, your own story. This is what you and your wife experience. And there are so many people who have their own version of that, whether or not there was wide-ranging sexual adventure initially. There is a difference in what each of you want and a question of how to navigate that. And while I'm going to talk about this in terms of sexual preferences, a lot of the things that I'm going to say pertain to other differences, like differences in financial priorities, spending versus saving. I think another area where there can be a lot of real differences in preferences and priorities is when it comes to parenting. But the conversation has a particular flavor, vulnerability, rawness, and confusion, actually, when it comes to these kinds of differences in sexual preferences. So let me lay the landscape, because with this, I've actually never met this couple. While I've interacted on email, and pretty much we've had some pleasant exchanges, but the bulk of the communication is what I just read. It was in the email inviting you to join me today. And otherwise, I don't know them. And so I can't speak to their situation so directly, because this is a kind of, I don't know if I'd say universal, but a very, very familiar situation where two people want something different when it comes to sex. They're in a situation where they're having wonderful orgasmic sex, but it still feels restricted. And as he said, let me quote him exactly, that these differences have come up as walls in our sex life. But from what he's written, it sounds like they're still having sex. They have a sex life that many people would envy. The point that I'm trying to make here is that I'm going to speak in general terms about how to navigate this terrain, which you're likely to either already be in or encounter at some point in a long marriage. And all I can give you without interacting directly, without knowing each of you and perceiving things in your interactions and in your patterns of speech and in what you say, that without having that one-to-one interaction, or 1 to 2, we'll say, the point is direct experience of you, I can only speak about how I think about this and how I recommend you navigate this terrain, which can lead to real breakdown, a difference in sexual preferences certainly can mean the end of a marriage. And it also can mean walls in our otherwise very good sex life. With that as the landscape, the first thing that I want to say is our sexuality evolves. Now, that's kind of a no-brainer. Of course it evolves. But there's so many assumptions that people have and memes in our society that actually don't integrate the reality that our sexual selves evolve. And so when it comes to porn or movies, like we tend, not entirely, but we tend to, when it comes to heteronormative sex, see one flavor of young, fit sex. And it has many aspects that are wonderful. And if you are young and fit and that feels good to you, by all means, have that kind of sex. But just as your personality evolves from life experience and you presumably grow in your capacity to manage your own finances, and maybe your clothing style evolves, or the genre of book you like to read, or who your friends are. It's unusual that somebody has one group of friends at 20 and they have that same group of friends at 40, 50, 60, and no other friends as well. The point is that in so many areas of our life, we fully expect to grow and evolve. And when it comes to sexuality, there just is a lot less expectation, and many people don't even realize that they have a fixed mindset when it comes to sex. And what that means is that you expect to keep having, or want, even if you don't expect it, you want to keep having the same kind of sex that you have in your 20s and 30s throughout your life together. And that just is not going to happen. That is not the human way, which includes growth and evolution. We are part of the natural world, and our preferences, our capacity for pleasure, our capacity to know what we want and communicate it successfully, like things evolve. Plus our bodies age and they function in different ways. So I think you got this idea that I'm saying in so many different ways. But the point is that sex and the sex you're having and your sexual identity are going to grow and change over the years. And that in and of itself is not something to resist. Now, it'd be nice to think that it always expands and we add to our repertoire and we continue to use all of our tools in our toolbox. But, there isn't really any area of life where that is the case. And so the first thing that I want to invite this couple to consider is to reframe how much of a problem this is, and instead line up with your sexual experiences being something that evolves and changes, and they're different than they were. And in another 10 years, they're going to be different again. Now, does that mean you miss some of what you used to have? Sure, no problem. But don't make it wrong that things have evolved. That's not the last thing I'm going to say, but it is the opening thing I'm going to say, because it provides a context for everything else. That if you think change is bad, you're kind of stuck in life. Now, restriction instead of expansion, that is something to find the way to pivot so it can be more expansion. But just looking for it to be the same as it was, that's not ever going to be the reality. So given that sex is going to evolve, then the next thing I want to emphasize is communication. Not just definitely communication about what you do and don't want to do with one another, but not just communicating about that. Also, being very careful about the meaning you make. Because if, for example, in this situation, the wife doesn't enjoy oral sex, I guess that could be receiving it. But I took it from the email. I inferred that it was in reference to giving oral sex to her husband. So if she doesn't want to give oral sex to her husband anymore, it's very easy and common for him to feel rejected, for him to feel unworthy, for him to feel less attractive. There are many different variations that can lead to resentment and ultimately disconnection of various kinds. And we don't know what has changed for her. We don't know why, and we also don't know what. Maybe her neck hurts, and the key is to find a position that's really comfortable for her. And it's just because they haven't had oral sex in a while, or she hasn't given it to him, they haven't taken the time. It's just too complicated to talk about it. But in that situation, I recommend you start all over. Is it literally the oral sex you don't enjoy? Or is it feeling like you owe it to your husband, or that you don't? Or is it not being like, body mechanics are so important. And when we're early in a relationship, we're willing to be uncomfortable in a way that just isn't true 3 decades into marriage. And so I would look at what are the variables that could be adjusted for this to be pleasurable again. And there may be none, but there may be some that, because you're in a kind of a standstill on this, you haven't had an opportunity to discover. So really asking, is there something particular that happened? Like, were you giving me oral sex and you got a neck ache and you don't want that again? Or is it just a gradual diminishing of interest? And if that's the case, well, let's get into oral sex in particular. This is not a well organized. I'm taking you into the landscape of differences in sexual preferences, and so we've been in the area of the landscape, which is all about how things change. Now we're in the area of the landscape about how to navigate things when it comes to a former interest in oral sex, woman giving it to man, and now that's diminished. And if that's the case, the next place that I would go in this exploration is for her to say whether or not, when she's given oral sex before, it was for her husband's pleasure or for her pleasure, or both. Because there are a lot of sexual things that we do for our partner with our attention on our partner's experience, and whether we lick faster or suck deeper or slow down or any of those kinds of things, it's based on what's going to feel good for our partner. And if that is the way that you give oral sex, I highly encourage you to shift and focus on your own pleasure. And in particular, I obviously do not have experience. I don't have a penis. I don't have a cock. But from men who've experienced a woman giving him oral sex for her pleasure, with her pleasure in mind, doing what feels good to her, that experience is so much better than when she's focused on what feels good to him. That's not bad, definitely not knocking it, but the level of connection and intimacy and pleasure for both of them is just so much richer and nourishing when she's really focusing on her pleasure as well. So for this couple that used to have more variety in bed, since we've already heard that she's very orgasmic, I would let her orgasmic nature guide things rather than doing anything specifically so that he feels good. And that means being able to start giving oral sex and moving away from that when she doesn't want to and returning to it when she does. There's a kind of a permission that, in particular, women, we don't give ourselves to really focus on our own pleasure and what feels good, even while giving pleasure and touching our partner. Sexuality evolves. We want to be very careful about making meaning when one person has new desires, new preferences, or doesn't want to do things. You want to be very careful what you make that mean about you, the state of the relationship, or your partner. For a woman or a man who wants to rekindle and expand sexuality, I cannot say enough how important it is to really focus on how you feel and your pleasure. Now, I'm not talking, of course, about being self-centered or narcissistic in any way. It's more that when you focus on your own pleasure in a way that is connected with your partner, the experience is really, really magnificent. Okay. Another element to add to this landscape for exploration is giving and receiving. For many couples, they get into a kind of a routine in terms of who's giving and how much, and who's receiving and how much. So one of my recommendations when you have differences in sexual preferences is to set things up so that one session, one time for sex, one lovemaking experience is really completely focused on one person's pleasure. Let's just say that you're going to focus on the woman first. Then if you're the partner, if you don't already know, and don't assume you do, so if it hasn't been very explicitly communicated, then ask, does she want candles? Does she want music? Does she want rose petals along the floor and up onto the bed? Like, what would make it lovely for her? Does she want you to read some love poetry? Or does she want you to be really more dominant with your energy? And when she comes in the room, you tell her exactly what to take off and where to lie down. Like, discuss what would be a wonderful experience and have the whole thing focused on her desire. And you can also schedule a time when the whole thing is focused on his desire. Now, I'm not ever going to recommend that either one of you do something that you don't actually want to do. You find a way to do this that works for you. But it's actually surprising how many couples have sex on a regular basis, but don't necessarily know what their partner really enjoys or would like to experience. Sure, you might know what has consistently worked in order for both of you to have an orgasm, or more in her case, but if you don't ask, if it's not what you've always been doing, you may not know what would be like what your partner would enjoy. So find out. And there's a lot of magic that can happen when you have all of the attention on one person's pleasure, and another time you have all of the attention on the other person's pleasure. Now, when you do that, by all means, make sure that as the one giving, that you're doing it from your own pleasure. Don't give as a kind of a duty or in order to pay back for the lovely time that you had receiving. You want to be in your own pleasure and enjoyment. And from there, really honor whatever works for you that your partner would like. Having times where you really take turns on whose pleasure you're focusing on allows attention, intention, connection, intimacy, and skills as lovers together to really grow and develop. And I guess one more thing that I will add to this is that it's very important to debrief. And if you're in if you're in a phase of your relationship where you're navigating differences and sexual differences, then I highly recommend that ahead of time, you set the intention. If you're like already making out, you don't have to stop and have an intention setting moment. But if that's how you do your sex and it ramps up quickly, then just set the intention for whenever you next have sex. But more likely, if you're in this kind of a phase where you're navigating sexual differences, then you're going to be a little slower to get going with the sexual experiences. And in that situation, set an intention. Have something you're playing with. So let me give you some examples. Like maybe you want to play with how you kiss throughout the whole time. Maybe you want to play with how much pressure you use with your hands wherever they're touching. Maybe you want to play with feeling the energy, the erotic energy, and learning to be guided by it. If you know what I mean, you know what I mean. If what I said is vague, don't worry about it. Pick something else. But the point is, set some kind of an intention for the sex you're about to have. Go ahead and have it. And either when you're both lying back, heads on the pillows afterwards, or, the next day, whatever feels right, you can debrief. I actually recommend you do your debrief like when the experience is complete, the next day or a few hours later, even the next week, but that you talk about in relation to the intention you set. Was it successful? What do you want to make sure to really build on? What do you want to do differently the next time? In other words, treat this as a growing organism that needs attention. Like this is a plant and you want to make sure it has enough light, enough water, enough nutrition, that you rotate where the pot sits on the windowsill so that it's exposed to the light from, so that instead of leaning over, it grows up straight. Similarly, your sex life is an evolving organism and you can focus on one variable and then another, but setting intentions and then doing some kind of a debrief afterwards is what's gonna help you both know what really is going to bring more delight. So getting back to this couple where he sent the email that started all of this, the fact that there's no shaming, no taboo, no trauma, none of that. Okay, but something shifted and you don't need to know what it is, but it can be very helpful. And I think one of the first questions that I would ask if I were coaching you directly, this couple, is, did this happen all of a sudden, or is this something that gradually happened? And if it happened all of a sudden, I'd want to know what else was happening in your lives. And if it happened gradually, I'd also want to know, is your body image changing? Or if this started when you turned 51, did one of your parents pass or get a terminal diagnosis at 51? Like, what associations do you have with that age? I'm not talking about kind of formulaic psychoanalysis. I'm talking about just asking questions, a kind of brainstorming to make associations, not in order to explain it, but because once you know yourself better, then things can flow, because this didn't just randomly happen. So it's either something like what I've just said, or the sexual experiences that you were having that you're no longer interested in having, they weren't actually as pleasurable as your husband has been led to believe. So something shifted, something isn't working for you, and you don't need to go into a whole thing in the past. But if you can connect with the part of you that needed to shut down for whatever reason, then you have the possibility of opening this up again. Although I will say, from the email that I read, I know that he wants to expand their sexuality, and I'm not actually sure whether or not she does, because we haven't heard from her. So when it comes to sex, the assumptions we make, the interpretations we make, the meaning we give things, it's extraordinary. And so one of the ways to navigate differences in sexual preferences requires more openness, more honesty, being able to say one's experience without blame. And I would be remiss if I don't tell you that the very best way to learn how to have those conversations is in my Aligned and Hot Marriage program. The program, I designed it for couples who have good, strong marriages and want more emotional connection, more sensual passion, more capacity to navigate the challenges that are particular to your relationship, whether it's differences in parenting styles, or differences in sexual preferences, or differences in finances, or differences in responsibilities around the house, whatever it is that arises and has you close your heart or close your legs, or just feel kind of more bland. In the Aligned and Hot Marriage program, I absolutely will show you how to open up again, get out of stuckness, and with very little effort and mostly fun activities, have more connection, more passion, more adventure, and definitely feel confident to navigate differences in sexual preferences such that you find solutions where you never imagined there were any. So if this is something that you're navigating, definitely enroll in the Aligned and Hot Marriage program. And there are two versions of it. One is the independent study version, which is available for you to go through, actually even on your own or with your spouse, and you do it at your own pace and can get benefit immediately, but take whatever time you want. And the whole thing is a very rich, private experience. And I also am so excited, because I don't do this very often, but I'm running a version of the Aligned and Hot Marriage program with live coaching, where we'll meet for, it's 8 sessions, but it's actually over 9 weeks because there's a holiday in there. And it's every week a 2-hour live coaching session where I will help you make all of the teachings relevant and discuss topics that I don't necessarily address in the Aligned and Hot Marriage program that are really specific to you. And one of the most exciting parts of the Aligned and Hot Marriage Live program is being with a very small number of other couples, because you learn so much from what other couples share and how they grow in just the same way that I shared this email as the starting off point for all kinds of rich learning that is available in every single session in the Aligned and Hot Marriage Live program. So if you are navigating anything in the realm of differences in sexual preferences or feeling like something that was open in your marriage is now closed down or closing down, don't delay enrolling in the Aligned and Hot Marriage program, either the independent study version, if that feels better for the two of you, or in the live coaching program, which I happen to be super excited about. I have had some of the most amazing learning myself in small group settings. I think it's very easy to think you would never want to do that in a group program, but anyone who's been in one of my group programs for couples would never say that. I still hear from people years later about how it really was a highlight experience, and they continue to use those tools every single day because of how they learn to implement them, which is something that I hear from people who've done the independent study version as well. And it looks like that's where we will complete for today, and see you next week.